The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review, Matt Dillahunty versus Matt Slick. Is secular humanism superior to Christianity? I love doing the debate reviews. I like going back and taking a look at debates I've done to find the mistakes that I made and to find the mistakes that my opponent made. The goal here is not to make everyone the best, public debater in front of an audience, although that would be nice. I know that most people aren't actually going to bother engaging in those kinds of debates. The goal is to give people an understanding of what took place so that when they're presented with something that seems strange in a conversation with another person, they have a better chance of understanding what's happening, that we can all learn and grow and get better. And ideally, I would like to just start playing the debate and move through it and talk about the arguments that were presented, and we'll do all of that. But this debate was a little unusual. First of all, Matt Slick and I have a bit of a history, and there's a lot to go through from the first time he called the show, through conversations on the Bible Thumping Wingnut podcast, to this debate that we're reviewing today. That's a lot to get through just to get to what happened in this debate. And I don't want everybody to have to sit through several 30 or 40-minute long reviews in order to get to the nuts and bolts of this debate. Is secular humanism superior to Christianity? Spoiler alert, yes, it is. Instead, I thought that I'd talk about what happened in this debate by way of analogy so that everybody would understand what happened. And then we can dig into the past and the arguments that were presented throughout this interaction that Matt and I had. So let's imagine for a minute that you and I are chess players, that we really like the game and we'd like to be better at it. Now, we could play a bunch of games, we could analyze a bunch of games, and perhaps we will do that, looking back at what's happened in the past to help us predict what's going to happen in the future. But we've decided that we want to discuss our respective strategies to see which one is actually superior. And I go first. I sit down and I point out that I think that maybe a good idea would be to take pieces and give them a point value. Be relative to how strong they are in a game. For example, if a pawn can basically only move forward in increments 1 and 2, two at the first one and 1 after that, and perhaps diagonally for captures or an en passant, something like that, we're going to give this a lower point value than we're going to give the queen. And then I talk about in games, as we make our moves and present our positions, we can look to see whether or not a position is open, whether there's easy access for pieces to move around, or perhaps closed if things are kind of boxed in, and how that changes the nature of the game. And I present all of this, and I make examples of various chess games from the past to say, hey, look, these people had a different view on the game, and it led to these conclusions. And then when I finish presenting my thoughts on why my strategy for chess is better, my opponent gets up and says, well, that's really neat, but Matt's view of chess and Matt's strategy for chess can't possibly be better than mine because Matt's strategy for chess doesn't explain the rules of the game. Now, this is particularly strange because we both agreed we're going to talk about chess, and we've agreed on the rules of chess, and we agree that we both care about winning. And it doesn't matter whether either of us can actually explain why the rules are the way they are. If we're going to talk about the strategy of the game, we have to talk about strategy within those rules. It doesn't matter whether my explanation of my strategy can also account for the rules of checkers, chess, or anything else. We have a framework here, and we're going to try to engage in a discussion about a strategy. If your response is to say, oh, well, to heck with all that strategy stuff, your explanation can't possibly account for the rules of the game, therefore mine, which I say can account for these, even though I don't actually demonstrate it, mine wins by default. There's that old adage about why you don't play chess with pigeons, because all they end up doing is knocking the pieces all over the board and pooping all over everything. And that's what happened in this debate with Matt Slick. I showed up to present a strategy, secular humanism, for human flourishing, the game of life. And from his opening statement on, all Matt talked about was how my strategy couldn't possibly be any good because it didn't account for why the rules of life, why logic and reason are the way they are. If we would have wanted to have a debate on that topic, perhaps we could have. Perhaps we already had. So I'm going to start by taking a look at how we went about figuring out what the topic of this debate should be, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of what happened during the debate. And hopefully, not only will people become convinced that, in fact, I presented a better strategy, but that Matt didn't actually show up to debate at all. He showed up to just knock the pieces off the board. That's not a debate, and it's not what we should be aiming for. So there are quite a few things from this particular debate that I want to get to, but we'll probably have to get to them in an entirely separate video following this one, because there's also a lot of background to cover as well. Matt Slick is a Christian apologist. He's got his own radio show, and he, I believe, is the founder, if not the current owner, of CARM.org, the Christian Apologetics Resource Ministry.org, C-A-R-M. He called the Atheist Experience TV show many years ago, 6, 7, 8, I don't know. It's been a while, to present his version of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. Now, we're back to presuppositionalism, and I'm not going to go through all that in this video. We'll cover that another time. The key element from this phone call is that he had presented his version of TAG, Transcendental Argument for the Existence of God, and I'd had a conversation with him. And during this conversation, Matt had said that everything is either physical or conceptual, that physical and conceptual represented a proper dichotomy, that these were the only two options, that everything falls into these two. And I pointed out that that simply wasn't correct, that the proper dichotomy would be physical and not physical, or conceptual and not conceptual. But that if you were going to claim that physical and conceptual were the only two options, you had to do a little bit more work. And that the things that we were talking about, the laws of logic, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, etc., they didn't fit into the physical category, and they didn't fit purely into the conceptual category. They fit into a third category, a category for which I didn't have a name. And Matt, who fancies himself an expert at logic and loves to talk about how atheists are so illogical, decided that this was a fallacy, and he was actually going to name this fallacy the Dillahunty Dodge, which I'm not going to actually get his entire description of the Dillahunty Dodge correct, because it's not a fallacy. But essentially, his position was, if someone presents two options and you say that there's a third option, but you don't have a label for it, that's the Dillahunty Dodge fallacy. You're avoiding this obvious conclusion. The interesting thing for me is that I was absolutely correct that physical and conceptual is not a proper dichotomy. The language alone makes this clear. Basically, you would have to be arguing that conceptual is identical with non-physical, not just that it's consistent with. But the interesting thing is that somebody went over to CARM.org after our discussion and asked Matt whether his God was physical or conceptual. And Matt's answer was that God was neither. The exact same answer that I had given, neither. Where do the logical absolutes fit? Neither. Now, in the heat of the moment when you're on television and you're having a discussion, not being able to come up with a label for something is hardly surprising. The very idea that I would be able to come up with any answer at any given time is already preposterous. And so Matt's entire fallacy was basically, because Matt Dillahunty can't think of a label for this concept that we're talking about, then it's a fallacy. It turns out the label that we were looking for is right there in the name of the argument, the transcendental argument for the existence of God. We are talking about transcendental things, things that transcend the physical, things that transcend the conceptual. There's other labels as well, and I'm not going to get into the entire discussion about proper dichotomies and physical and conceptual and tag. I just wanted to bring it up because this was the beginning of my interaction with Matt Slick, and that he repeatedly, as we'll see in some comments from these debates, portrays himself as a master logician. Now, I offered my reasons for why I didn't accept the transcendental argument for the existence of God as he presented it, but I'm not the only one. You can do a quick Google search for Alex Malpass's deconstruction, where he's actually interacting with Matt Slick and explaining why Matt's argument is awful. And you can watch Matt's reaction when he realizes that in fact he's constructed a circular argument. And Matt and his friends actually ask Alex for help in rehabilitating this argument. What can we do to make this argument not fallacious? I'll leave that to Alex. He's far better at it than I am. But because Matt just kept going on and on about the Dillahunty Dodge and talking about me on the radio show, we ended up having another debate on the Bible Thumping Wingnut YouTube podcast. I'm going to do a review of that at some point because there's some interesting moments in there where I made the accusation that there were like 14 or 16 fallacies in this short little parade of sentences. Now, I think that was an exaggeration. I don't think there were actually 14 or 16 fallacies, but the point was that in this particular discussion, it was just flawed thinking after flawed thinking, just stacking it all up. And when the debate was over, I left and they sat around and basically talked trash about me, but that's fine. I get that. One of the things is that I don't look at debates as a win-lose proposition. I don't walk into a debate saying, I'm going to win. I walk into debates saying, I want to be able to present the best case for my position that I can, expose flaws in the case that is presented to me by the opposition, and to encourage people to think about things. I've talked before about the structure of debates and, the joint press conference format where I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, and there's no real interaction. I would much prefer to have debates where two people are sitting down having a conversation, which is why I was so pleased when Blake Junta agreed to come down, sit down on the couch, and we had a 3-hour conversation over a couple of different subjects that I think really got to the heart, or close to the heart, of where our disagreement rests. That is the sort of conversation that I want to promote. But you can't do that if you don't have a good understanding of what's actually going on. And one of the mistakes that people make is in deciding what the debate topic is going to be, not just the format, but what specifically are we going to be discussing. Because Matt looked at me as someone who was constantly dodging, I'm ducking and dodging, bobbing and weaving, because I'm not, arguing that, there is no God. Instead, I'm pointing out, as a proper skeptical position, that the claim that a God exists hasn't met its burden of proof. The burden of proof rests firmly on those who are claiming that a God exists. And so when we have these debates, their perspective of what I'm doing is that I'm not actually doing any work at all. I'm just poo-pooing everything they say. Yeah, that's partially true, but that's not my fault. If you adopt a position and you've adopted a burden of proof, somebody doesn't have to adopt a contrary position with a contrary version of a burden of proof in order for you to have a discussion. You can have a discussion, a debate about whether or not you've met your burden of proof. This frustrated Matt to no end. And my understanding is that he had flatly said on the radio show or somewhere else that he wasn't going to accept any debate topic that didn't put me on the defense, where he wanted me to come in and have to defend something. And I'm happy to do that, provided you're having me defend something that I actually believe. If you want me to come in and defend a position I actually hold, I'm thrilled to do that. And I'd like to see more of that. So we set out to try to find a debate topic. Unfortunately, the debate topics presented betrayed not only a lack of understanding about my position, a lack of understanding about how to properly construct a true dichotomy, something that Matt and I have had disagreement about all these years, but also some grammatical issues that are the result of sloppy thinking about the subjects, as if these two things need to be at odds. So I want to take a look at the debate topics that he proposed and talk about those, and then talk about how and why we settled on the topic that we chose. Now, I'd like to say at the outset that as I go through these, I'm not doing this just to mock Matt or to make Matt look silly. We are all guilty of sloppy thinking on occasion and grammatical errors. But if you're going to be engaged in a debate and you're going to make suggestions about what the debate topic should be, that is the point where you should probably be the most diligent about making sure that you are constructing a debate topic properly. So let's take a look. I was sent 7 proposed debate topics. None of them were acceptable, and for varying reasons. Many of them didn't present any sort of true dichotomy. It wasn't clear about what the burden of proof was. Some of them the way they were grammatically constructed, the answer was just yes or no. So for example, the very first debate topic that I was presented was, is atheism, and you can substitute humanism or naturalism, thank you so much, is atheism or Christianity a logical position to hold? Yes? No? Is atheism or Christianity a logical position to hold? Now, first of all, whether or not something's a logical position to hold is already kind of a pointed question. Do we mean, is it reasonable to hold this? Is it internally consistent? Is it in conflict with logical laws? But when you set up a question of, is atheism or Christianity a logical position to hold, what are we actually talking about here? Should this be phrased, which is more rational to accept, atheism or Christianity? But atheism isn't a positive assertion that there are no gods. It's a rejection of the claim that there are gods at a minimum. So that's already a problem. Atheism and Christianity don't represent a proper dichotomy in the same way that physical and conceptual don't represent a proper dichotomy. But the thing is, perhaps they might both be logical to hold, whatever logical to hold means, or maybe neither of them are logical to hold, depending on what we mean by the definitions. This entire first proposed debate topic is just a mess. Is atheism or Christianity a logical position to hold? I think the goal was, since he wanted me to defend something, he didn't want to just come and defend his Christianity. He wanted me to defend some position that I hold, which is why he suggested that I could substitute humanism or naturalism. Well, the problem here is that, is humanism or Christianity a logical position to hold? Has the same problem. And so does naturalism and Christianity. And they don't even represent mutually exclusive opposites. It's not like you couldn't be a Christian and be a humanist. You could be. You might have a different definition of Christianity that excludes specifically the tenets of humanism. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one couldn't identify as a Christian in some sense and a humanist in some sense. But this idea of naturalism keeps popping up over and over. We'll get to his take on naturalism when we start taking a look at what he said in the debate. But you'll see from these topics that what Matt really wanted me to do was defend philosophical naturalism. Now, at some point, I'll go do a detailed discussion about why I don't identify as a philosophical naturalist and why I do identify as a methodological naturalist. But the nuts and bolts are that philosophical naturalism, in a simple sense, says the natural world is all that exists. And that's a proposition that, while I think it's reasonable, if you were to phrase it, the natural world is all that can be shown, or all that has been shown to exist. We don't know what can happen in the future. Maybe we find a way to talk about something beyond the natural world. But methodological naturalism is that acknowledgement. It is, we are going to look at the world and we don't get to appeal to the supernatural. If we're going to have explanations about why things are the way they are, we need to stick with the natural, because the natural is all that we can demonstrate, all that we can interact with and show to be real. But Matt desperately wants me to defend philosophical naturalism. And I'll point out, even before we get there, that when you go read the Secular Humanist Manifesto and other secular humanist writings about what secular humanism is about, they, I would say mistakenly, make appeals to philosophical naturalism. They go a step further than I think we should go. Instead, I would say that I'm a methodological naturalist, I am a skeptic, I am a humanist, a secular humanist, based on those and not on philosophical naturalism. Let's take a look at some of the other debate topics that were proposed, and then we'll get to the one we picked and why I chose it. So the second topic that I was presented with is, which is logical to believe, naturalism or Christianity? So here once again we're trying to tie me to naturalism. Here once again we are setting up a false dichotomy, naturalism or Christianity. And once again, we're using this confused language about which is logical to believe. I'm a little pickier with my words, and I would say, is it reasonable to accept naturalism. But he's basically talking about philosophical naturalism, because methodological naturalism is just a recognition of our own limits and what we can and can't investigate. The third debate topic: which worldview is more logical to hold, naturalism or Christianity? These first three topics seem to be rephrasing the same thing over and over again. He wants to come and defend Christianity, and he wants me to defend naturalism, a position which I've pointed out repeatedly isn't my position. Number 4, which is logical? A secular humanist worldview or a Christian worldview? This seems to be another restatement of the first one. It's like there's an idea in his head about what he thinks this debate should be. That he's going to walk in and defend one position, and I'm going to walk in and defend some other position, and he's desperate to find a way to do that. But because he doesn't seem to understand my position and can't seem to pin me down, he's flailing. The fifth one: is atheism a logical position to hold? I almost went with a version of this one because I like the idea of defending non-belief, non-acceptance of a position. If atheism is the rejection of the claim that a God exists, it doesn't have a burden of proof in the sense of it needs to demonstrate that no God exists. It does have a burden of proof in the sense that it needs to show why it is rational to reject theistic claims. And maybe that's what he means by a logical position to hold. But this weird fetish-like use of the word logic and logical over and over throughout these suggested topics, I think speaks volumes about what Matt does or doesn't understand about logic. And I've spoken to logic professors who have gone head-to-head with him on this, who seem to agree. Now, he loves rationality, but he wants to frame it all in the terms of logic and the logical absolutes, and it all fits into this tiny little framework that he's going to defend at all costs. By the way, even after seemingly acknowledging that his tag argument was flawed, he hasn't stopped using it. Instead, he seems to have found a way to spin his thoughts on it as if they're not flawed. Number 6 was, is it logical to believe God exists or does not exist? Now, grammatically, this is a mess. Is it logical to believe that God exists or does not exist? Why, yes. Yes, in fact, it is logical to believe that God exists or does not exist, because those are two mutually exclusive. Finally, we have a proper dichotomy. Either God exists or does not exist. And so, is it logical to believe God exists or does not exist? The answer is yes. Now, perhaps if you rephrased it to, is it reasonable to believe that God exists, or is it reasonable to believe God does not exist? Then you get to the heart of what I think he's really saying, although I'm not a mind reader. He wants to one person defend the claim God exists, and the other to defend the claim that God does not exist. The problem is that now he's trying to tie me to a defense of strong atheism, the positive assertion that there is no God. And I have engaged in conversations about that, but I don't do it in public debates because it's not a requirement. It is not the minimal atheist position. And my failure to prove that God doesn't exist doesn't in any way tell us whether or not God does exist. The burden of proof should rest on those who are saying that God exists. It should also rest, by the way, on those who are saying God does not exist. You have a positive position, you're presenting it, you have a burden of proof in order to convince someone. But what you can convince people of is separate from what's actually true, what's actually reasonable. And a failure to convince someone that X is the case doesn't mean that it becomes reasonable to conclude that X is not the case. The 7th proposed topic was rather strange. Was Jesus God according to the Bible? For example, excluding the Quran, etc. He wanted to have a debate on whether or not Jesus was portrayed as being God by the Bible. Now, I'm well aware, as I've had these discussions with atheist friends of mine, that there are people who say, yeah, the Bible doesn't portray Jesus as being God. I disagree. I think that any reasonable reading of the Bible clearly leaves one with the impression that Jesus was portrayed and portraying himself, to the extent that we know what he said or did, as being God or being co-equal with God. I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Before Abraham was, I am. And the verb tense there is important, and all these other things. It's so reasonable that this is how we ended up with Christianity. The very idea that an itinerant Jewish rabbi was the Messiah who was in fact God. This is a core principle of Christianity. It would be bizarre to me to say that the Bible doesn't portray that as a reasonable position or a reasonable assessment of what's actually being said in the Bible. So we've got a debate topic proposed where he and I don't necessarily disagree. And what's worse is that even if we did disagree, whether or not the Bible portrays Jesus as being God is completely separate from whether or not Jesus was God. It's like saying, hey, was Harry Potter the chosen one according to the books? I know there are people out there who've argued that an alternate hypothesis, that Harry wasn't the chosen one, that there was somebody else who was the chosen one. And I won't spoil that for you. You can go and look it up. But by and large, it's just accepted that this is the case. This is the inference that's been drawn from this. This is what perhaps it even clearly says. At least believers are convinced of it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the Bible says about Jesus, because you'd first need to demonstrate that the Bible is correct about what it says about Jesus. And so I had been presented with these topics that had grammatical errors, that were not true dichotomies, that were trying to tie me to positions that I didn't hold, or trying to arrange a debate on something that we don't even disagree on. That's not the way one should prepare for a debate. So those were the proposed debate topics, and Beth and I were driving in the car from Austin to Houston for an event, and she had read through these topics and we discussed them. And I was trying to find a way to salvage this debate. One of the most difficult things is to find a debate opponent who's actually willing to engage in public. It's not as easy as you might think. I get a lot of requests from people saying, oh, would you debate so-and-so? Well, I don't actually make arrangements. I don't do events. I don't just reach out and contact people and say, hey, you want to do a debate? Instead, event organizers do these sorts of things. I've done several debates and will do more, I hope, with the Bible and Beer Consortium. They've been outstanding. They've provided me a podium. They work out the details with opponents. We talk about formats and we go. Travis Pangburn from Pangburn Philosophy, who set up an event with me and Dawkins, is going to be setting up several other debates, a debate with Frank Turek and others. There are Christian organizations that have reached out to me and said, would you be willing to have a debate with so-and-so at our church or at this venue or at this convention? And my default answer is to find a way to say yes almost every single time. Hey, would you like to debate Mike Licona here in a couple months? Yes, absolutely. I agree to the debate, and then we work out the details. You don't have this option when you're engaging with family members, when you're engaging with coworkers, when you're engaging with street preachers, when you're actually just happen to find yourself in a conversation. You don't get to pick the topic. But what you can do is, when the conversation begins, make sure you're defining terms, make sure that you're very clear on what it is that each of you is presenting. What is your actual position? What is it that you're trying to defend? Is the question that we're talking about structured in such a way that it could just be answered with a yes, as was the case with some of the ones we talked about? So we were driving to Houston, and I recognized right away, okay, Matt Slick wants me to defend a position. Great, I'd love to do that. I spend a lot of my time just pointing out why people's defense of their position on various versions of theism simply isn't justified. But I do have positions. I do have things that I believe. I think things that I believe are true, things that I believe are better. Now, there's no way I was going to let him tie me to positions that I don't hold, like philosophical naturalism. And before everybody writes in to say, oh, why don't you accept philosophical naturalism? We'll have a discussion about that. And actually, I'm hoping to get somebody who's advocating for philosophical naturalism, because I think that one of the big problems has to do with something we've discussed here, and that is the language, the issue of whether or not one is being clear about a position. Because I'm happy to say that the natural world is all that apparently exists. It is all that demonstrably exists. I'm just not willing to go the extra step of saying the natural world is all that exists, because you can't know that. What happens someday if we find out there's more than the natural world? What does the multiverse model, does it qualify as the natural world? I think it does. And one of the most common questions somebody asks is, hang on a second, if there was something that were proposed to be supernatural, and then we find out it's real, and we begin to understand how it works through exploration and the application of skepticism, critical thinking, and the scientific method, would it then become natural? Would it become within the definition of the natural world? And that's a good question, because the answer may be yes, and it may not be. But I didn't want to defend something that I didn't believe. I didn't want to accept a topic that was sloppy, but I knew that he wanted me on defense, and he had mentioned that I could substitute humanism. And so one could ask, oh, is Christianity superior to secular humanism? Now you have two people presenting two positions. There's no declaration that these are the only two positions. It's just a straight comparison. Is this one superior to this one? Not, is this one the best and all the others suck? It's not, is this one inferior and therefore all the others inferior as well? There's no extended slippery slope fallacies in any of this. It's, here's my strategy, here's your strategy. Which one of them is superior? Now, I didn't phrase it as, is Christianity superior to secular humanism? Because it was clear that he didn't want to be on defense. But you're just comparing two worldviews, so it really doesn't matter how you put it. And so I suggested, is secular humanism superior to Christianity? Because that has me defending the proposition that my worldview, my strategy for human flourishing, is superior to the strategy that he's offering. This is superior to the strategy of modern Christianity, of perhaps different versions of Christianity, but at a minimum, superior to what he was offering. And when I thought of the topic, and I immediately sent it back to the organizer and said, there are problems with all of those other debate topics, suggest this one and see if he'll accept it. I was happy when he accepted it. And shortly after he accepted it, I actually had a quick phone conversation with him about another debate that he'd done. And we agreed in this short conversation that the sticking point with the topic was this idea of superior. Is it superior on what grounds? Is it superior because it's easier to pronounce? Is it superior because it has fewer tenets and therefore it's simpler and you don't have to complicate the way people think? So the ground upon which something became superior was the foundation for the entire debate. The thing that really surprised me, which we'll get to when we start going through what actually happened in the debate, was this. Matt agreed that we were both sharing a real world. Set aside whether or not either of us can demonstrate this, whether either of us can solve the problem of hard solipsism. We agreed that we were sharing the same physical universe, and that we agreed what the laws and rules within that universe were. And we agreed that we both cared about human flourishing, the betterment of society. And my point was that secular humanism is all about human flourishing. It has as its central tenet this idea that we seem to not be able to appeal to the supernatural, that appealing to gods hasn't resolved anything for us, and that if we find ourselves stuck, we don't have any good reason to think that there's a God who's going to come get us out of that problem, who's going to make that situation better for us. And given that, we need to find a way to do better, to encourage human interaction that benefits us all, that leads to a better world. Now, you can have all kinds of discussions about what it means by what's meant by a better world. Better for who? Better in what way? Those are important conversations to have. But secular humanism allows you to have those conversations. It allows you to have discussions about what standards we're going to use. What I expected in this debate was a defense of the idea that the things that secular humanism valued were wrong, that instead we should be valuing what God wants, that instead we should be concerned with the next life far more than this life. These things tie into Christianity's worldview. But that's not what I got. What I got was agreement that we care about human flourishing. I got agreement that we're living in this world. And yet, there was no real defense of how Christianity could be superior. Instead, Matt began his entire topic by trying to tie me to philosophical naturalism and by making the outlandish claim that because secular humanism couldn't account for why the rules of the game were what they were, that it couldn't possibly develop a strategy. As if not knowing how your car works means that you couldn't possibly come up with a strategy on how to potentially fix it. That precludes the opportunity to learn about how your car works. I may not know the chemistry behind an internal combustion engine, but through trial and error alone, I may be able to discover enough about how my car works to develop some sort of strategy to make sure that it works better. And if it turned out to be the case that another person knew how and why the car worked, and they came up with a better strategy, this would be demonstrable. This would be something you could show to be the case. And I was hoping for some sort of defense that Christianity has this ability, that it has this understanding. Instead, what we got was an assertion that it does, no demonstration that it does, and a bold-ass claim that secular humanism can't, so it's just done, and all that work that Matt put into explaining to why secular humanism is better for human flourishing, it's just brain fizz. But we'll get to that when we start going through the debate.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.